Everett Holloway's hand came down on Eliza Monroe's kitchen table so hard the tin cups rattled and the kerosene lamp nearly tipped. "Sign it," he said. Not asked, not suggested. Said it the way a man says something he believes has already been decided. Eliza didn't move. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her jaw tight, looking at the paper in front of her. A document that would transfer the deed to her family's ranch, 240 acres of Montana land that her father had broken his back on for 30 years, to the Holloway Land and Cattle Company. "I said sign it, Eliza." "I heard you the first time." He leaned down until his face was close to hers. He smelled like expensive tobacco and cold ambition, and his eyes had gone flat in a way she had never seen before. Not the charming eyes of the man who'd brought her wildflowers and called her remarkable. These were the eyes underneath all of that. "You have until morning," he said. "After that, I can't be responsible for what happens to this ranch." He walked out without closing the door. Eliza sat alone in her kitchen for a long time, listening to the Montana wind come through the gap he left behind. If you have ever been backed into a corner by someone who counted on you being too afraid to fight back, then you already know exactly how this story feels. Stay with me. Because what Eliza Monroe did next is something none of them ever saw coming. And if this is your first time finding this channel, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. Because the stories we tell here are the kind you won't forget. Hit that like button and drop a comment letting me know what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to where this really started. Eliza Monroe had been waking up before dawn her entire life. Not because anyone told her to. Not because there was a schedule written somewhere or a voice calling her out of bed. She woke up because the ranch didn't wait. The cattle didn't wait. The broken fence line along the eastern pasture didn't wait, and neither did the slow leak in the water trough she'd been meaning to patch for 3 weeks, but hadn't had the time or the spare materials. She was 29 years old, and she moved through the early morning dark the way a person moves through a place they know by memory. Around the corner of the barn door without looking, over the raised plank near the gate that would catch your toe if you weren't paying attention, past the old iron post her father had driven into the ground the year she was born, and that had been leaning 2 degrees to the west ever since. Her father, Thomas Monroe, had died 4 years ago. A bad winter, a bad chest, and a stubbornness about seeing the doctor in town until it was far too late. Her mother had gone 7 years before that, quiet and quick, a fever that moved faster than anyone expected. Eliza had no siblings, no aunts or uncles who were close enough to matter. What she had was the land, 2 aging ranch hands named Gus and Percy, who had been around since before she could walk, and a reputation in Dustvale, Montana, as the kind of woman people didn't quite know what to do with. She wasn't married. That was the first thing. She ran her own operation. That was the second, and she was good at it. That was the thing they never said out loud. The town of Dustvale had a way of looking at Eliza Monroe the way you look at something sitting in the wrong place. Not offensive, not a scandal, just out of order. A woman alone on a working cattle ranch was the kind of situation people expected to resolve itself eventually. She'd sell the land. She'd marry someone practical. She'd move into town and take up sewing or bookkeeping or something that fit inside a building with walls and a roof. She hadn't done any of those things. 4 years after her father died, the Monroe Ranch was still running. It wasn't prosperous. Some years it barely cleared enough to keep Gus and Percy's wages paid and the property taxes settled. But it was standing, and Eliza was standing with it, which meant something, even if Dustvale wasn't exactly sure what. She was patching the water trough on a Tuesday morning in early October when she first heard about Everett Holloway. Gus came across the yard with his hat in his hands, which was how he always delivered news he wasn't sure about. He was 63, bow-legged, and had a face so weathered it looked like it had been left out in the elements on purpose. "Fella named Holloway's come to town," he said. "Rich one, from what they're saying, looking to buy up cattle operations out this way." Eliza didn't look up from the trough. How rich? Denver money rich. Maybe back east money rich. Hard to say. She pressed the patch down and held it firm. "A lot of men come through here looking to buy things," she said. "Most of them don't know a steer from a plow horse." Gus nodded once, the way he nodded when he wasn't done talking but wasn't sure how to keep going. "This one's been asking around about you specific." That made her look up. "By name?" she said. "By name. Gus confirmed. She turned back to the trough. Well, she said after a moment, if he wants to talk, he knows where to find me. Everett Holloway found her the next afternoon. He rode in on a horse that cost more than Eliza's barn, wearing a coat that had never seen a winter. He was 45 or thereabouts, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a quality to his posture that said he was accustomed to people paying attention when he entered a room. He dismounted at the gate with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his welcome. Eliza was in the yard mending a length of split-rail fence when he walked over. She didn't stop working. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Mr. Holloway," she said, without looking up. She'd had enough time to learn his name. He seemed briefly surprised, then amused. "You've heard of me?" "Small town," she said. "News travels." He looked at the fence she was working on. He looked at her hands, the kind of hands that had done real work, calloused and capable, not the hands the women he knew in Denver had. He looked at the yard, at the barn, at the cattle visible beyond the fence line, and he was quiet long enough that she finally looked at him. "What do you want?" she said. "I want to talk business," he said, "but I'm happy to wait until you've finished." "I'm listening now," she said. "I can do both." He almost smiled. "I'm acquiring land in this area," he said. "Good ranching country. I believe Montana's about to see a growth period that most people here haven't anticipated. I'm looking for operations that have potential." "And you think mine does?" "I know it does," he said. 240 acres, water access from the Eastern Creek, good pasture land. You've kept it running single-handed for 4 years. "With help," she said. "Gus and Percy." "2 men," he said. "On a spread this size, that's not help. That's barely enough to keep the wheels on." She set down her tools and looked at him directly. "What are you offering?" He named a number. It was a fair number, more than fair. It was the kind of number that would pay off every debt she had, set her up comfortably for years, and still leave something left over. She knew immediately what it meant for him to offer it, that he'd done his homework, that he understood the land was worth it, and that he also understood she was the kind of person who would know if he tried to lowball her. She said nothing for a moment. "I'm not interested in selling," she said. He didn't flinch. "Then I'd like to talk about a partnership arrangement," he said. "I invest capital in the expansion of this operation, and we share the returns." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and there was something in it. Not just the calculation of a businessman, but something else. Something that she didn't entirely trust, and wasn't sure she was meant to. "I'll think about it," she said, and picked up her tools again. He left the same way he came. Easy. Unhurried. Like a man who fully expected to get what he wanted and wasn't worried about the timing. That evening, Eliza sat on the front step of the house and tried to think clearly, which was difficult because Caleb Westbrook's wagon had just come up the road and she could hear it from where she was sitting. Caleb came every week, had done for 3 years. Officially, it was because the Monroe Ranch was on his route from his place to the supply store in town, and it was easier to combine the trips. He'd pick up what Eliza needed, she'd pay him back on delivery, and it saved her a half-day's ride each way. Practical, neighborly. The kind of arrangement that didn't mean anything, except it did mean something, and they both knew it, and neither of them had said a word about it in 3 years. He was 34, lean and dark from working outside, with quiet eyes and hands that were always doing something, fixing something, holding something, checking something, because standing still without a purpose made him uncomfortable. He'd had the Monroe Ranch on his route since a month after Eliza's father died. He'd never said why he started coming. She'd never asked. He pulled up to the gate and climbed down. "You got a list for me?" "Inside," she said. "I'll get it." She went in, found the list she'd made that morning, came back out. He was standing where she'd left him, looking at the fence she'd been working on earlier. "You fixed the corner post," he said. "Gus started it," she said. "I finished it." "That post's been leaning since summer," he said. "I know," she said. "I had other things." He took the list from her. Their fingers didn't touch because they were both careful. She'd noticed that. She'd noticed that he was always careful. "I heard Holloway came by," he said. "Word gets around." "It does," he said, not looking at her. "What did he want?" "To buy the ranch," she said, "or invest in it." He wasn't fussy about which. Caleb nodded slowly, still reading the list even though he'd probably already memorized it. "He's bought 3 spreads already," he said. "Henderson's. The old Pruitt place. And somebody out by the river I don't know. I didn't sell, she said. He looked up then. I know, he said. That's not what I was. He stopped, started again. Just making sure you had the information. I have the information, she said. He looked at her for a second longer than usual, then folded the list and put it in his pocket. I'll have your supplies by Thursday, he said. I know, she said. You always do. He drove away, and Eliza stayed on the step until the sound of the wagon was gone, and then stayed there a little longer, because the quiet after Caleb left always took a moment to settle into something comfortable. She hadn't told him what Holloway had said at the end, when he'd turned back before mounting his horse. A woman running a ranch alone, he'd said, almost to himself. That kind of determination deserves more than this. She hadn't known what to do with that sentence. She still didn't. The next time Everett Holloway visited the Monroe Ranch, he brought lunch. Not a gesture, an actual meal, packed in a proper basket by the hotel cook in Dust Vale, with a cloth napkin and everything still warm. He set it up on the fence rail without asking, pulled out 2 portions, and handed her one as though it had been arranged. She was too hungry to object. It had been a long morning. You're determined, she said, eating. I prefer the word focused, he said. I haven't changed my mind. I know, he said. I'm not here to change your mind. I'm here to understand it. She looked at him sideways. That's a different approach. Most men come out here and tell you what they think, he said. I've been told I do that too sometimes, but I'm trying not to today. He pulled a small notebook from his coat. Would you be willing to walk me through the property, the operation? I'd like to understand how you've kept it running. Nobody had ever asked her that. Not like that. Not as a genuine question. Not with a notebook in hand and an expression that said he was actually prepared to listen to the answer. She took him through the entire operation that afternoon. The pasture rotation schedule she'd modified the second year when she realized her father's old system was overgrazing the south field. The water management she'd had to rethink when the creek level dropped during a dry summer. The breeding records she kept in a ledger with a level of detail that made him stop and ask to look at it more closely. This is meticulous, he said, turning the pages. It has to be, she said. When you don't have much margin for error, you learn to track everything. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ledger. Then he said, Miss Monroe, I've looked at a dozen cattle operations in this territory in the last 2 months. Most of the men running them couldn't have told me half of what you've told me this afternoon. She didn't say anything. She took the ledger back and tucked it under her arm. I'm not saying this to flatter you, he said. I'm saying it because I think you should hear it plainly. I've heard it, she said. Thank you. But something had shifted in her chest slightly. A small, careful thing, the way a door shifts when the latch doesn't catch all the way. She told herself it was professional respect. That was a reasonable thing to feel. He was a businessman who recognized competence, that was all. She told herself that twice more over the following week, during which Everett Holloway came back twice, and each time brought something, not extravagant, not designed to impress, but specific. The first time, a particular kind of fence staple she'd mentioned offhand as being hard to source locally. The second time, a newspaper from Denver with an article about cattle market projections that he'd folded open to the right page. He paid attention. That was the thing. He listened, and then he proved he'd been listening, and Eliza Monroe, who had been surrounded by people who looked past her for her entire adult life, found that harder to dismiss than she expected. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything directly. That wasn't his way. But on Thursday, when he delivered her supplies, he was quieter than usual, and he spent longer than necessary checking the load in the wagon bed before he left. You see him again? He said finally, with his back still to her. Holloway? She said. Yes. He's been in town a lot, Caleb said. People are talking. People always talk, she said. What are they saying? He turned around. His expression was carefully arranged, which meant it was covering something. That he's courting you, he said. Or trying to. He's discussing a business arrangement, she said. Is that what it is? Said Caleb. It wasn't a question. It was a statement with a question tucked inside it, one he was deciding not to ask directly. Eliza looked at him. He looked back. The wind came through the yard and moved a strand of hair across her face, and she pushed it back and waited to see if he was going to say the actual thing he was working up to. He didn't. I'll see you next week, he said, and got in the wagon. She stood in the yard and watched him go and felt, For the first time in 3 years, something very close to anger. Not at him. Or not only at him. At the whole shape of it. This silence they'd both maintained so carefully, this arrangement that was never discussed because discussing it would require one of them to risk something, and neither of them had been willing. She was tired of waiting for things to resolve themselves. But the anger hadn't had time to settle into a decision before everything changed, and the change came from a direction she hadn't been watching. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Everett Holloway first rode through her gate, when Eliza was going through the month's accounts at the kitchen table and found something that didn't add up. She'd been careful with money her whole life. Careful in the way you're careful when there isn't much of it, and losing track means losing everything. She kept every receipt, every bill of sale, every record of payment and delivery. Her ledger was precise. Her father's ledger, which she'd kept and cross-referenced, was precise too. But tonight, looking at a property tax notice she'd received that week, the third notice, which was unusual because she always paid on the first, she found a number that was wrong. The amount listed was for an acreage that didn't match her deed. It was larger, by almost 40 acres. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got out her deed, which she kept in a locked box under the floorboard in her bedroom, and she compared the numbers, and she looked at the property tax notice again, and the cold feeling that moved through her was not panic, it was recognition. Someone had made a change to the county property records, and the change was not in her favor. She sat very still at that kitchen table for several minutes. Then she got up, put on her coat, and saddled her horse in the dark. She needed to see someone who would know what this meant. She needed to see someone she trusted completely, without question, right now. She rode to Caleb Westbrook's ranch. It was past 9 o'clock when she arrived. The light was still on in the front room. She tied her horse at the post and knocked, and when he opened the door and found her standing there with the property notice in her hand and something fierce and frightened in her eyes, he stepped back immediately. "Come in," he said, no questions, just that. She came in and put the paper on his table and told him what she'd found. He read it twice. He read the deed when she produced it from her coat pocket. He set both documents side by side and looked at them for a long time without speaking. "This isn't a clerical error," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." He looked up at her. "Eliza," he said, and then carefully, "this is the same thing that happened to the Henderson property, the Henderson ranch, one of the 3 that Holloway had bought." She went very still. "The Hendersons sold because they thought they owed back taxes on land they'd never claimed," Caleb said quietly. "But there were people at the county office who said afterward the records looked strange." She looked at the paper on the table. She looked at her deed. "He paid attention to everything I told him," she said, mostly to herself. "The pasture layout, the water access, She stopped. "The notebook." He'd been taking notes in that notebook the entire afternoon she walked him through the ranch. "Eliza," Caleb said. "He's been doing this on purpose," she said. "The lunch and the newspapers and it was information. He was gathering information. The anger from earlier in the week, the slow, steady kind she hadn't known what to do with, suddenly had somewhere to go. It moved through her cleanly, without the panic attached to it, and left behind something cold and very clear. She picked up the paper and folded it carefully. "I need to see the county records," she said. "All of them, not just mine." "The county office opens at 8, Caleb said. "I know when it opens," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll come with you." "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," he said. He said it simply, without the weight of an argument or an offer she could refuse, just a statement of fact. He was coming. That was it. She looked at him across the table, at the careful way he was holding himself, the way he always held himself around her, like something contained. She thought about the wagon driving away last week. She thought about 3 years of Thursdays. But now was not the time. The paper in her hand was more pressing than 3 years of unsaid things, and she had learned long ago to deal with the most immediate crisis first. 8 o'clock, she said. "I'll meet you there," he said. She rode home in the dark, and the wind was sharp and cold off the mountains, and she let it clear her head. She thought about Everett Holloway's eyes going flat over her kitchen table. She thought about the document he'd wanted her to sign. She thought about the fact that she hadn't signed it, and she thought about all the ranchers in this valley who probably had. The Monroe Ranch was not the beginning of this. It was not the end of it either, and Eliza Monroe, who had been keeping something alive by herself for 4 years on the margin between surviving and failing, suddenly understood that the fight she was walking into was not just about her 240 acres. It was about every piece of land in this valley that somebody had decided was easier to take than to buy honestly. She unsaddled her horse. She went inside. She didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her ledger, her deed, and the property notice, and she began to write down everything she knew, everything she'd seen, everything Everett Holloway had said to her over the past 3 weeks, and everything that, in retrospect, should have told her sooner what he actually was. By the time the first gray light came over the mountains, she had 4 pages of notes and a clarity of purpose that felt almost frightening in its stillness. She washed her face, changed her shirt, and saddled her horse again. There was work to do. The county records office in Dustvale occupied the back half of the town hall building, a low-ceilinged room that smelled like dust and old paper and the particular staleness of documents nobody looked at twice. A single clerk named Ordell Marsh ran the office 6 days a week and had done so for 11 years. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the careful, slightly defensive posture of someone who was used to people treating him like an obstacle. Eliza arrived at 5 minutes to 8. Caleb was already there, standing outside the door with his hat in his hand, which meant he'd probably been there since 7:30. He looked at her when she came up. She looked like someone who hadn't slept, because she hadn't, but she'd scrubbed her face clean and her eyes were sharp, and she was carrying the folder of documents she'd assembled through the night. He didn't comment on any of it. "Marsh comes in right at 8, he said. "Not before." "I know," she said. They stood side by side on the wooden walkway in the early morning cold. A dog crossed the street at the far end of town. Somewhere behind them, the hotel was starting its breakfast service, and the smell of coffee drifted out. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said, which was not exactly a lie because she had closed her eyes for about 40 minutes around 3 in the morning. He didn't press it. At 8 o'clock exactly, Ordell Marsh unlocked the door and walked in without looking at them, and they followed him inside. "Miss Monroe," he said, hanging up his coat. "Mr. Westbrook." His voice was professionally neutral, the way a man's voice gets when he's learned that expressions of surprise tend to create complications. "I need to see the property records," Eliza said, "specifically the filing records for the last 6 months. Any amendments or transfers in the Dustvale Township." Marsh stopped with his coat half on its hook. "That's a broad request," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He turned and looked at her. He was reading something in her face, and whatever he read made him straighten up slightly. "Any particular properties?" "Mine," she said, "and the Henderson property, and the Pruitt place, and the Bellamy Ranch on the river." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Those are all properties that changed hands recently," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking." He looked at Caleb, who was standing with his arms crossed and his expression giving nothing away. Then he looked back at Eliza. "Give me a few minutes," he said. He went to the back shelves, the ones that held the heavy-bound ledgers, and the boxes of filed amendments, and he began pulling things. Eliza stood at the counter and watched him, and kept her hands flat on the wood so they didn't betray anything. Caleb came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold room. "You all right?" he said, very quietly. "Ask me again in an hour," she said. Marsh came back with 3 ledgers and a box of loose filings. He set them on the counter and stood back. Eliza opened the first one. She found the Monroe property record in 12 minutes. The amendment was dated 3 weeks ago, the same week Everett Holloway had first visited her ranch. It had been filed as a correction to an original survey error, which was a common enough category that a busy clerk with a full desk might not have looked at it twice. The correction added 38 acres to the taxable acreage of the Monroe property and attached a notation referencing a survey conducted by something called the Western Territory Land Assessment Company. She had never heard of that company. No surveyor had ever set foot on her land. "Look at this," she said, and turned the ledger to face Caleb. He read it. His jaw tightened. She went to the Henderson file. Same pattern. A correction filing, 2 months earlier. A different number of acres, but the same category, the same notation, the same company name. Pruitt. Same. Bellamy. Same. She lined the 4 filings up side by side on the counter, which was physically impossible because they were in bound ledgers and she couldn't remove the pages, but she held them open and looked from one to the next, and the pattern was so clear and so deliberate that it made her feel briefly lightheaded, not from fear but from the particular vertigo of understanding something ugly that has been sitting right in front of you. Marsh, she said. He had been standing at the side of the room, pretending to organize something. He came back to the counter. This company, she said, the Western Territory Land Assessment Company. Do you have any documentation on them? A filing certificate? An operating license? He went to a different box. He spent longer than he should have. When he came back, he said, I have a one-page filing from 7 months ago, a business registration. She took it and read it. The registration listed a business address in Helena. The named operator was a man called R.T. Caldwell. She didn't know that name, but at the bottom of the page in the section for affiliated parties, there was a second name, Everett Holloway. She set the paper down on the counter very carefully. Caleb read it over her shoulder. She felt him go still. He filed these amendments himself, she said, or had them filed, under a company with his name on the registration. Marsh, Caleb said. Who accepted these filings? Who processed them? Marsh was already looking uncomfortable in the way of a man who has realized he is standing at the edge of something much larger than he signed up for. The amendments come through standard processing, he said. I handle some of them. Deputy Clerk Sutter handles others. Sutter, Eliza said. Is he here today? He doesn't come in until 9, Marsh said. She looked at the clock on the wall. 40 minutes. She straightened up and looked at Caleb. I need copies of all of this, she said. I can't copy county records without a formal request, Marsh began. Then I'm making a formal request, she said. Right now, in writing. She picked up the pen from the counter, pulled a piece of paper from her folder, and wrote out the request in clear, steady handwriting, dated and signed, and pushed it across to him. He looked at it for a moment. Miss Monroe, he said, and his voice had changed slightly, gone quieter. I want you to understand that this office processes what comes through the appropriate channels. Whatever's in these records, Marsh, she said. Not unkindly, just clearly. I'm not here to make trouble for you. I'm here to find out what happened to my property records and 3 others. If everything was done properly, then that'll show up in the documents, and we'll be on our way. She waited. Make me the copies. He made the copies. They were back outside by 9:15 with a folder full of papers, and the kind of silence that happens when 2 people are both thinking hard and don't want to interrupt each other. They stood on the walkway and Caleb said, He's planning to run the same thing on your ranch that he ran on the others. Drive up your tax obligation on paper, wait until you can't pay, and then step in with an offer. Except he already stepped in with an offer, she said, before the tax notice came. Maybe he expected you to be easier to handle than you were, Caleb said. And when I wasn't, she said, he decided to apply more pressure. She thought about his hand on her kitchen table, the flatness in his eyes. Sign it. The document he wanted me to sign last night. It was a deed transfer. Caleb looked at her sharply. He came to your house? Last night, she said. After I found the tax notice. He must have known I'd found it. She paused. Or he'd already planned to make his move and the timing was a coincidence. That's not a coincidence, Caleb said. His voice had gone tight in a way she didn't hear from him often. No, she said. It probably isn't. They stood there another moment. Down the street, the town was waking up around them, wagons coming through, the hardware store opening, 2 women from the church committee walking past with baskets, and not quite looking at Eliza and Caleb standing together outside the county offices at 9 in the morning. Who else knows? Caleb said. Nobody yet, she said. I came straight to you. He was quiet at that. She didn't elaborate. The Hendersons already sold, he said. Pruitt, too. Bellamy. I don't know their situation. I do, she said. I know Ruth Bellamy. She mentioned last month that they'd gotten a tax notice they couldn't account for and were thinking about selling before it got worse. She folded the papers and put them in her coat. They haven't signed anything yet. I'd stake a good deal on that. You want to go talk to them, he said. I want to go talk to every ranch owner in this valley who might have gotten one of these notices, she said. But first I want to talk to someone who can tell me if what's in those records is enough to take to a judge. Caleb tilted his head slightly. There's a lawyer in Mill Haven, he said. Harriet Frame. She's sharp. Handled the water rights case for the Garvey family 2 years ago and won. How far is Millhaven? Half a day's ride. She calculated. It was barely past 9. If she rode hard, she could be back before dark. Can you check on my ranch while I'm gone? She said. Make sure Gus and Percy are all right. Don't tell them everything yet. I don't want anyone talking before I know what we have. I'll go out this afternoon, he said. Then, after a pause, Eliza. She looked at him. He's going to know you went to the records office, he said. Marsh might not say anything, but if Sutter's connected to this in any way, I know, she said, which is why I need to move fast. He looked at her for a moment with that careful, contained expression she'd spent 3 years learning the edges of without ever quite knowing what was underneath. Be careful on the road, he said. I'm always careful, she said. You're always competent, he said. That's not exactly the same thing. She looked at him, surprised, and he looked back, and for just a second, something in his expression wasn't careful at all. Then he put his hat on and said he'd see her tonight, and he walked to his horse, and she watched him go with a feeling she was deliberately not examining because there was too much else to do. She rode to Millhaven. Harriet Frame's office was above a dry goods store on the main street, accessed by an outside staircase that creaked on every step. Harriet herself was 51, compact and direct, with silver hair cut practically short and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. She listened to Eliza for 20 minutes without interrupting, looked at every document in the folder, and then sat back and was quiet for a moment. The Western Territory Land Assessment Company isn't licensed in Montana Territory, she said. I know because I looked them up 2 months ago when another client mentioned their name. Eliza went still. Who was the client? I can't share that, Harriet said, but I can tell you that I sent an inquiry to the Territorial Land Office in Helena and received a response indicating that this company has not completed the registration requirements for operating in this territory, which means every assessment they've conducted here is legally invalid, which means the amendments they filed are based on invalid documentation, Harriet said, which means the amended tax notices are not legally enforceable. She set down the folder. This is fraud, Miss Monroe, coordinated and deliberate, and if Holloway's name is on the registration, it is, Eliza said. I saw it. Harriet pushed her glasses up. Then you have a problem that's larger than your own property, she said. Because if this is a pattern, and what you're showing me suggests it is, then there are ranchers in this valley who have already been defrauded. The Hendersons and the Pruitts sold under duress based on fraudulent tax claims. That's not just fraud. That's potentially criminal conspiracy. Eliza looked at the folder on the desk between them. What do I need to do? She said. You need documentation from every affected property, Harriet said. The original deeds, the amended records, and evidence connecting Holloway to the filings. What you have is a strong start, but it's your property and the registration document. I need more before I can take this to a territorial judge. How much more? 2 more properties with the same pattern, minimum, Harriet said. And ideally, a witness, someone inside the scheme who can testify to how it worked. Eliza thought about Deputy Clerk Sutter. She thought about the way Marsh's voice had changed when she pressed him. Give me 3 days, she said. Harriet looked at her steadily. Holloway will know you're building a case before those 3 days are up, she said. Men like this, they don't wait. I know, Eliza said. Neither do I. She rode back to Dustvale faster than she'd ridden out. The afternoon was turning cold and the light was going flat and gray in the way that meant the temperature would drop hard tonight, and she pushed her horse on the last stretch because she was running the same thought over and over. 3 days. She had to move in 3 days, and she had to move without tipping her hand, and she had to convince people who had every reason to be frightened to stand with her anyway. She pulled up to her ranch as the sun was going down and found Caleb's horse still tied at the post, and Caleb himself sitting on her front step with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. He stood up when he heard her coming. Gus and Percy are fine, he said. Nobody's come by. Good, she said, dismounting. How did it go in Millhaven? She told him. All of it, quickly and without embellishment, because they were running out of time for anything else. He listened with his arms crossed and his face doing that thing where it was working through what she was saying 2 steps ahead of where she was in the telling. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The Bellamy Ranch, he said. I know Jack Bellamy. He'll listen. I need to go to them tonight, she said. Tonight, he repeated. If Sutter's involved with Holloway, he'll have told him I was at the records office by now, she said. I can't afford to wait until morning. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and then he set down the cold coffee on the step and said, Then we go tonight. She shook her head. You don't have to… Eliza. He said her name the way he sometimes did, flat and direct, with no inflection to argue with. You came to my house last night. You rode to Millhaven and back in one day on no sleep. You're building a case against a man who has already shown up at your door and threatened you. He stopped. I'm coming. She looked at him standing in her yard in the dying light with his jaw set and his eyes steady on her, and she felt something that she couldn't name and didn't have time for. Fine, she said, but you have to keep up. Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite a smile. I'll manage, he said. They rode to the Bellamy Ranch together in the dark. Ruth Bellamy opened the door before they'd even knocked, which meant she'd heard horses on the road, which meant she'd been listening for something she was expecting. She was 53, broad-shouldered and weathered, with the particular composure of a woman who had absorbed enough hard news that she'd stopped flinching when the next one came. She looked at Eliza, she looked at Caleb. She said, Come in. Jack Bellamy was at the kitchen table. He was older than Ruth by 10 years, slow-moving now from an old back injury, with sharp eyes and a creased face. He looked at the folder Eliza set on his table the way a man looks at something he half expected to see. We got the tax notice 8 weeks ago, he said, when she'd explained what she'd found. Couldn't make sense of it. The numbers were wrong, but we couldn't figure out why. Because they were wrong on purpose, Eliza said. The amendment to your records was filed by a company that isn't legally operating in this territory. The assessment they used to justify the amendment doesn't exist. Ruth looked at her husband. Jack looked at his hands. Henderson sold, Jack said. Pruitt, too. I know, Eliza said. They didn't have another choice, Ruth said, and her voice was tight with something. The tax burden would have taken the land anyway. Except the tax burden isn't real, Eliza said. That's what I'm telling you. The notices are based on fraudulent filings. A lawyer in Millhaven has confirmed it. If you take this to a territorial judge, if all of us take it together, there's a case here. A real one. Jack looked at her. His expression was complicated in the way of a man weighing something against something else that had nothing to do with law. He's powerful, Jack said. Holloway. Men like that, they've got reach. They've got money for lawyers and money for other things. I know, Eliza said. You're asking us to stand up against that, he said. Yes, she said. I am. The kitchen was very quiet. Ruth Bellamy looked at Eliza Monroe across the table for a long moment, and Eliza looked back, and she didn't sell it. She didn't dress it up or promise more than she could deliver. She just held the woman's gaze and let the situation be what it was. What do you need from us? Ruth said. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Your deed, she said, and your tax notice, and 3 days of your patience while I put together everything else. Jack looked at Ruth. Ruth gave him a small nod that meant something they'd been married long enough to communicate without words. I'll get the lockbox, Jack said, and pushed himself up from the table. Riding home an hour later, the night was cold and clear, and the stars were out in the way they get above Montana when there's no cloud cover, filling the whole sky from edge to edge. They rode without talking for a while. Eliza was running numbers in her head, what she had, what she needed, who else she had to reach. There were 4 other ranch properties in the valley she hadn't checked yet. She needed to get to each of them before Holloway found out how much she knew, and she needed to do it in a way that didn't look like what it was. You thought of this all last night, Caleb said eventually. Some of it, she said. The rest came together this morning. You've been doing this alone for a long time, he said. Not an accusation, an observation. There wasn't anyone to do it with, she said. He was quiet for a moment. There could have been, he said. She looked at him, riding beside her in the dark, and he was looking straight ahead, but his voice had been careful in that way that meant the opposite of careless. Caleb, she said. I know, he said. Not now. That's not what I was going to say, she said. He looked at her then. I was going to say… She stopped. Started again. 3 years is a long time to wait for someone to decide you're worth the risk. The words landed between them in the cold air, and he didn't say anything immediately, and she turned her horse away before he could, because she meant it, but she wasn't ready for the answer, whatever it was. "We have work to do," she said, "and I need you sharp for it. So whatever this is," she gestured vaguely at the space between them, "it'll keep." She rode on ahead. He didn't argue. He fell into pace beside her a moment later, and they rode the rest of the way to her ranch in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd started the night with. Something had shifted in it, some weight redistributed, like a beam settling after you finally put it where it belongs. She unsaddled her horse, and Caleb helped without being asked, because he knew where everything went in her barn. At the gate, he stopped. "I know 4 of the other ranchers in the valley," he said. "Personally. I can reach them without raising flags, just neighborly visits. You tell me what to ask, I'll do the asking." She looked at him. "You'd do that," she said. "I already said I would," he said. She nodded. "Wednesday morning," she said. "Meet me at the county office. I'll have everything compiled by then. If I can get the records from 2 more properties, Harriet Frame says she can file with the territorial judge." "Wednesday," he said. He picked up his reins and then he said, without looking at her, "3 years is a long time, but I haven't been undecided." He rode out before she could respond. She stood at the gate in the dark for a moment with her hand on the post, and she thought about that sentence, and then she deliberately set it aside because there was too much else at stake, and she could not afford to be distracted by the things she'd been half hoping to hear for longer than she was willing to count. She went inside. She opened the folder on the kitchen table, the copies from the county office, the documents from the Bellamy's, Harriet Frame's notes, and she spread them out and started working. She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally slept, she slept with the folder under her pillow and the kerosene lamp turned down low, because she had learned by now that keeping important things close was not paranoia. It was just sense. The 2 days between Monday night and Wednesday morning were the longest Eliza Monroe had lived through since the winter her father died. She didn't sleep much. She didn't expect to. She moved through those 48 hours the way she moved through calving season, on instinct and necessity, putting one thing in front of the next, not looking too far ahead because the full picture was too large to hold all at once without losing your footing. Tuesday started before sunrise. She rode out to the Carver property first, 8 miles east of town, arriving while the family was still at breakfast. Walt Carver was 60 and stubborn, and had initially refused to even look at her folder, standing in his doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw set. "I got no quarrel with Holloway," he said. "You will," she said. "Can I show you something?" He let her in. His wife Dora brought coffee without being asked, which Eliza took as a sign that Dora had already made up her mind and was just waiting for Walt to catch up. She spread the documents on their kitchen table the same way she'd spread them on the Bellamy's table the night before, and she walked Walt Carver through every line. He got quiet halfway through. The particular quiet of a man recognizing something he'd been trying not to see. "We got a notice," Dora said when Eliza finished. 6 weeks ago. We thought it was a survey error." "It wasn't," Eliza said. Walt looked at his wife. Dora looked at Eliza. "What do you need?" Dora said. By noon, Eliza had the Carver deed and tax notice added to her folder. She ate half a biscuit on horseback and kept moving. The next property was the Sutton Ranch, 12 miles north. Old Pete Sutton had already been approached by Holloway's people twice and had sent them off his land both times with language that would have embarrassed a mule skinner. He took one look at the documents Eliza brought, said, "I knew something was crooked," and went to get his lockbox without another word. 2 down. By late afternoon, she had visited 5 properties total. 3 had tax discrepancies that matched the pattern. 1, the Marsh family's small spread near the creek, had received a notice but hadn't yet been able to trace the problem. And when Eliza showed them the connection to the Western Territory Land Assessment Company, the youngest Marsh boy, who was 17 and sharp-eyed, asked if he could keep a copy of the filing certificate for the company. "Why?" she said. "Because I can read," he said, "and there's something in the address that looks wrong." She let him have the copy. The 5th property was harder. Frank Dunnigan lived alone on a small operation south of the Bellamy land, and Dunnigan was the kind of man who had come to distrust everyone equally over 63 years of disappointment. He stood on his porch and listened to Eliza with his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed, and when she was done, he said, "How do I know you ain't working for somebody yourself?" She didn't get angry. She understood why he asked it. You don't, she said. Not yet. But look at the documents. Look at the registration certificate with Holloway's name on it, and then ask yourself if you really got a survey error notice 6 weeks ago for 43 acres you've never claimed. He was quiet. 41 acres, he said. Not 43. Same company, she said. Same filing category. Same pattern. He took the papers from her hands and studied them for a long time on his porch without inviting her in, and when he was done, he handed them back and said, "What do you need?" She told him. He went inside and came back with his deed and a battered tax notice and a look on his face like a man who's decided to walk into something knowing it might go badly and has made his peace with that. "Wednesday morning," she said. "County office. Bring what I just told you." "I'll be there," he said. She rode home as the light was failing, calculating in her head. 4 confirmed properties with matching irregularities. The Bellamy's made 5. Her own made 6. And Harriet Frame had said she needed 2 minimum beyond Eliza's own property to file with the territorial judge. She had 5. What she didn't have was certainty about the county office itself, about whether Deputy Clerk Sutter had been notified, about whether Holloway already knew what she'd collected and was preparing a countermove. She'd been riding out in the open all day, visiting ranches, and she wasn't naive enough to think that went unnoticed in a valley this small. Caleb's horse was at her gate again when she arrived home. She was starting to expect it, which she noted and filed away for later. He was inside this time. Gus had let him in, which meant Gus had decided Caleb Westbrook had sufficiently established himself as someone who belonged in this kitchen, a threshold that Gus did not lower easily. Caleb was sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a cup of coffee. He looked up when she came in. 4 ranchers, he said. I got to 4. I got a 5, she said, dropping into the chair across from him. He slid his paper across. 4 names, with notes beside each one about what they'd received and when. She read it and then pulled out her own folder, and they spent 20 minutes cross-referencing because 2 of his 4 overlapped with 2 of hers, and the remaining 4 between them were properties she hadn't reached. That's 10 affected properties, she said. At minimum, he said. There may be more we haven't gotten to. She sat back. 10 properties. The Henderson Ranch and the Pruitt place already sold. That was 2 that Holloway had already converted. The others were still in play, still being pressured with fraudulent tax burdens, still waiting to collapse under weight that wasn't real. Tomorrow morning, she said. County office. 8 o'clock. I'll be there, he said. Gus appeared in the kitchen doorway with the particular expression he wore when he was about to say something he considered unnecessary to say, but felt should be said anyway. You eaten anything today? He said, looking at Eliza. This morning, she said. Half a biscuit on a horse doesn't count, he said, which meant he'd been watching her ride out this morning and had seen exactly what she'd taken with her. Gus, she said. I'm making supper, he said, and disappeared back into the other room. Caleb was watching her with a look she didn't immediately categorize. He's right, he said. I know he's right, she said. I've been managing. You've been running since Sunday night, he said. 3 days on almost no sleep and not enough food, and you're about to walk into a county office and try to take down a man who's been doing this for months and has money and connections, and I know what he has, she said quietly. He stopped. She looked at him across the table. I know exactly what he has, she said again. I'm not doing this because I think it's easy. I'm doing it because if I don't, I lose this land. And so do 10 other families. And that's not something I can look at and walk away from. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. All right, he said. What do you need me to do tomorrow? She told him. The plan was specific and she'd been building it in pieces since Monday night. Harriet Frame would ride up from Millhaven in the morning. Eliza had sent a wire yesterday confirming the timeline and the volume of evidence. They would meet at the county office at 8 before Sutter arrived and request access to the full property amendment records for the past year. Frame would formally document everything while Eliza presented the affidavits she'd collected from the affected ranchers, signed statements, which she'd drafted last night and asked each family to review and sign when she visited. She'd gotten 7 signed affidavits out of 10 visits. Good enough. What about Sutter? Caleb said. That depends on what he does when he walks in and finds us there, she said. If he's been processing these amendments under Holloway's direction, he's going to have a problem. And if he gets to Holloway before we're done, he'll try to pull the filings, Caleb said, or destroy them. Yes, she said, so we need to be done before he can make that call. We need to be done before he realizes what we're doing, she said. Which means we need Marsh. Caleb looked at her. Marsh? He knew something was wrong, she said. He went quiet when I pressed him. He made those copies without much argument. She folded her hands on the table. Marsh isn't in on it. He's just been afraid to look at it directly. You think he'll help? I think he's been waiting for someone to make it safe enough to help, she said. I'm going to give him that tomorrow. Gus brought in supper, and they ate at the kitchen table. Plain food, nothing elaborate, and Eliza ate all of it, which was not something she would have done if anyone had been making a point about it. But Gus hadn't made a point, so she ate. Afterward, Caleb helped clear the table, and Gus went to bed, and the two of them were left in the kitchen in the quiet, which should have been simple, but wasn't. You should sleep, Caleb said. I will, she said. Soon. He was putting on his coat. He did it slowly, the way he did things when he was thinking about something else. Last night, he said, without looking at her. What I said. On the road. She waited. I meant it, he said. I'm not... He stopped. I'm not going to make this the wrong moment. You've got enough on your mind. He pulled on his second glove. I just didn't want you to think I forgot I said it. She looked at him standing in her kitchen with his coat on, the same man who'd been driving a wagon through her gate every Thursday for 3 years. The same man who'd come inside without asking when she knocked on his door at 9 o'clock at night. The same man who'd ridden to the Bellamy Ranch in the dark without being persuaded. I didn't think you forgot, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded and said goodnight and let himself out, and the door closed softly behind him, and Eliza sat at the table and let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, everything she'd been setting aside since Tuesday. Then she picked up the folder and went over the documents one more time, because tomorrow required her to be sharper than she'd ever been. And sentiment, however earned, was going to have to wait. She was wrong about one thing. She'd assumed she had until morning. At 11:20, Gus knocked on her bedroom door and said there was someone at the gate. Not Caleb. Someone she didn't know. A boy, maybe 16, who'd ridden out from town. She was dressed in 2 minutes. The boy was the young Marsh, the 17-year-old from the ranch near the creek. He was breathing hard from the ride, his horse lathered, his face tight with urgency and something that might have been fear. I found it, he said, before she'd even gotten through the gate. The address on the filing certificate for the land company. It's not real. What do you mean it's not real, she said. The street address in Helena, he said. I've been to Helena. That address is a vacant lot. Has been for 2 years since a fire took the building. He reached into his coat and brought out the copy she'd given him, folded and refolded until the creases were soft. Somebody registered a company at an address that doesn't exist. Eliza looked at the paper in the lantern light. The address. 412 Creston Avenue, Helena, a vacant lot. You're sure, she said. My uncle has a hardware business on the same block, he said. I was there in August. The lot's been empty. They cleared the rubble but haven't built. She held the paper for a moment. A company registered at a non-existent address. Not just an unlicensed company. A phantom company. Paperwork built on nothing, filed with a county office by a man with money enough to make people not look too carefully. What's your name? She said. Daniel, he said. Daniel Marsh. Daniel, she said. You just made this significantly easier to prosecute. She folded the paper and held it. Were you followed? He blinked. I don't think so. Go home, she said. Go home and don't talk to anyone about this tonight. In the morning, come to the county office at 8. Bring your father and this piece of paper. He'll come, Daniel said. I already told him. She watched him ride back toward town and then stood at the gate in the cold for a moment. A phantom company. It meant Holloway hadn't just committed fraud in the way a careful criminal commits fraud, covering his tracks at each step. He'd committed it in a way that assumed no one was going to look. He'd assumed the ranchers in this valley were too isolated, too poorly connected, too financially desperate to mount any coherent resistance. He had assumed no one would come to the county office with a lawyer and 7 signed affidavits and a 17-year-old who'd been to Helena. She went back inside. She did not sleep. At 7:15 Wednesday morning, Harriet Frame rode into Dustvale from the South Road, arriving at the county office steps at the same moment Eliza came up from the east on horseback. They looked at each other across the hitching post. You look like you haven't slept in 3 days, Harriet said. 2.5, Eliza said. How much do you have? Eliza held up the folder. Harriet took it and paged through it in under 2 minutes, standing on the steps in the early morning cold. Her expression shifted somewhere in the middle, not dramatically, just a slight compression of the mouth, the look of someone recalibrating what they thought they had into something better. This is more than 2 properties, Harriet said. 6 confirmed with affidavits from 7 households, Eliza said, and a registration certificate for the land company that lists a non-existent address in Helena. Harriet looked up from the folder. That last part, she said. The building burned 2 years ago, Eliza said. The lot's been vacant since. Harriet was quiet for 2 seconds. That's not fraud built on bad paperwork, she said. That's deliberate criminal construction. This isn't a property dispute anymore, Miss Monroe. This is a territorial criminal matter. I know, Eliza said. Which means we're not going to a civil judge, Harriet said. We need the territorial marshal's office. Eliza had been turning that over since midnight. Can you file today? I can file a complaint and a formal evidence submission today, Harriet said. With what you have here, they'll be required to open an investigation. She closed the folder and looked at Eliza steadily. But Holloway needs to not know this is happening until the filing is done. Once it's on record, he can't touch it. Before that, he can try to pull the original filings, Eliza said, or discredit us some other way. Or both, Harriet said. Where's the clerk in all of this? Marsh is not involved, Eliza said. His deputy, Sutter, maybe. Marsh will cooperate. You're confident of that? Confident enough, she said, which was the most honest answer she could give. Caleb arrived at 5 minutes to 8, with Jack Bellamy behind him, and then Daniel Marsh with his father, and then Frank Dunnigan, who had apparently ridden in the dark because he was 40 minutes from town, but arrived at the same time as everyone else. Walt Carver and Dora came last, Dora still pinning her hair as she walked, and then Pete Sutton, who arrived on foot because he'd walked his horse until it threw a shoe a mile out and had covered the last mile himself without mentioning it to anyone. 9 people on the steps of the county office when Ordell Marsh unlocked the door at 8 o'clock. He looked at all of them. He looked at Harriet Frame, whose legal bag he clearly recognized as the kind carried by people who meant business. He looked at Eliza, who was standing in the center of the group like something that had grown there. He stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," he said, and his voice was quiet and resolved, like a man who'd been expecting this and had decided, somewhere in the last 2 days, what side of it he was going to be on. They came in. The next 45 minutes were methodical and specific. Harriet Frame worked through the records with Marsh, pulling the original filings and comparing them to the amendments, documenting the chain of handling for each one. Eliza sat at the side table with the affidavits laid out, going through each one with Harriet's clerk, a young woman named Agnes who had ridden up from Millhaven with Harriet and wrote in a fast, precise hand that impressed Eliza considerably. The ranchers stood around the edges of the room, not in the way, not loud, just present. It mattered, having them there. It mattered in a way that Eliza hadn't fully anticipated. The weight of it, 9 people standing in a county records office on a Wednesday morning because they'd decided to stand together rather than lose what they'd built. At 8:43, the door opened. Deputy Clerk Sutter walked in. He was 38, stocky, with a clerk's habitual indoor pallor, and he stopped in the doorway and took in the room in the way a man takes in a situation he was not prepared for and immediately understands is bad. His eyes went to Marsh. Marsh met his gaze and didn't look away. Sutter's eyes moved to Harriet Frame's legal bag, to the open record ledgers, to Eliza Monroe standing at the side table with a folder and a face that told him nothing. He took one step back toward the door. "Mr. Sutter," Harriet Frame said, without looking up from the ledger she was examining, "we'll need you to remain in the office, please. I have some questions about the processing of several property amendments, and you'll want to have your responses on record." Sutter's hand was on the doorframe. "I'm not required to," he began. "You're a deputy county clerk," Harriet said, looking up now. Her voice was perfectly even. "You're required to respond to a formal legal inquiry regarding official documents in your care. If you leave this office before that inquiry is complete, that will be noted in the filing, and it will not reflect well on you." She held his gaze. "I'd sit down if I were you." The room was very quiet. Sutter looked at Marsh again. Marsh's expression was the expression of a man who had made his choice and was not going to help Sutter make a different one. Sutter came away from the door and sat down. He answered every question. Not easily, not without long pauses and careful phrasing, but he answered because the alternative was to walk out of that room and directly into a worse version of the same problem. By the end of the second hour, he had confirmed that certain amendments had been processed outside the normal workflow, brought directly to him rather than going through standard intake, and that he had been told the paperwork was pre-authorized at a level above the county office. "Who told you that?" Harriet asked. Sutter looked at the table. "Mr. Sutter," Harriet said. "Holloway," he said, "or a man who worked for him. They said it was a territorial directive, that the land company was doing government-contracted survey work." Harriet made a note. "And you didn't verify that with the Territorial Land Office?" A long pause. "No," he said. Harriet made another note. Eliza was watching from the side of the room, holding the folder in her hands, and she felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction because the work wasn't done yet, but was close to it. A sense of the pieces clicking into their proper positions. The compound structure of something that had been built on false foundations beginning to show its shape for what it actually was. Harriet gathered everything into her legal bag, organized and documented and cross-referenced, and she turned to the room. "I'll file the formal complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena this afternoon," she said. "Given the nature of the evidence, I expect an investigation to be opened within the week. I would advise everyone in this room to keep copies of your property deeds and original tax notices and to make no transactions with any party claiming authority over your land until this process is resolved." Jack Bellamy said from the back of the room, "What about the people who already sold? The Hendersons and the Pruitts?" Harriet looked at him. "If the sales were completed under duress from fraudulent tax obligations, there may be grounds for reversal of the transactions," she said. "That's a longer process, and I can't promise an outcome, but it's not off the table." The room absorbed that. Then Pete Sutton, who had walked the last mile here on foot and had not said a single word during the entire proceeding, said, "Somebody should go tell the Hendersons." "I will," Eliza said. Sutton nodded like that was always the expected answer. Outside the county office, the morning had turned bright and cold and sharp, the kind of light that made Dustvale look cleaner than it was. The ranchers stood in a loose group on the walkway, and there was a quality to the air around them. Not celebration, not yet, but something that was the precursor to it. A collective exhale. Caleb found Eliza at the edge of the group. He came to stand beside her, not crowding, just there. "Well?" he said. "Well?" she said. "Sutter's going to tell Holloway," he said quietly. "He probably already sent someone." "I know," she said. "He can't undo a formal legal filing." "He can make trouble," Caleb said. "He can try," she said. The distinction mattered. She'd been careful about that distinction all her life. The difference between someone having the power to make things difficult and actually having the power to win. Everett Holloway had assumed the second because no one had ever mounted a serious challenge to the first. She looked down the street at the town of Dustvale, which was going about its Wednesday morning. She thought about the years she'd spent in this town being looked past, being the woman with the worn boots and the sunburned hands that nobody quite knew what to do with. "He's going to come after me directly," she said, "now that Sutter's told him." "Probably," Caleb said. "He'll try something," she said. "I don't know what yet, but he'll try." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Then we stay close," he said. She looked at him. "To the ranch," he said. "Between now and when the marshal's office responds. Just—" He stopped. "You shouldn't be out there alone if he decides to make a move." "I've been alone out there for 4 years," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm suggesting you don't have to be." He said it steadily, without the careful containment she usually heard in his voice, and this time she didn't look away from it. "All right," she said. "Stay close." It wasn't a grand moment. He just nodded, and then Harriet Frame came out of the office, and they turned back to the work, because there was still more work, and the next piece of it had already started when she said she'd tell the Hendersons herself and meant it. But something had changed again. Another small weight, redistributed. She noticed it the way she noticed things on her ranch, not dramatically, just as information that mattered and needed to be accounted for. She would account for it later. First, there was everything else. An hour after they left the county office, A rider passed through Dustvale, heading south at a pace that suggested urgency. Nobody who saw him made much of it. But Ordell Marsh, watching through the office window, recognized the horse. It belonged to Everett Holloway's man, a silent fellow named Cruz who ran errands and asked no questions about what they were. Marsh watched the horse disappear down the south road, and then he went back to his desk. He didn't go after Sutter to ask what had just been set in motion. He already knew. He'd known since Monday morning when Eliza Monroe walked into his office with a folder under her arm and that particular look in her eye. Not anger, not panic, just the steady, clear look of someone who had figured something out and wasn't going to let it go. He'd known then that this was going to end somewhere, one way or another. He just hadn't known, until this morning, that he was going to be on the right side of it when it did. Cruz rode south and Eliza rode east, and Dustvale went about its Wednesday, not knowing that both of those things mattered. The Henderson Ranch was 11 miles from town, down a road that turned to ruts after the first creek crossing and didn't improve after that. May Henderson was in the yard hanging laundry when Eliza arrived, and she turned around with the expression of a woman who had grown accustomed to bad news arriving on horseback. She was 57, raw-boned and careful, with the kind of stillness that comes from absorbing too many hard things to have room for dramatic reactions anymore. Her husband Art had moved them into a rented house in town after the sale. She was out here going through what remained, the last of the personal things they hadn't been able to carry when they left. "Miss Monroe," she said. "May," Eliza said, dismounting, "I have something to tell you, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what to think." May looked at her for a moment, then set down her laundry and sat on the porch step. Eliza told her everything. She kept it plain and direct, the same way she'd learned to deliver hard truths on the ranch. No softening that would make it harder to absorb. The fraudulent company, the phantom address, the pattern of amendments, the filing that morning with Harriet Frame, the fact that the tax obligation the Hendersons had sold under was not legally valid, had never been legally valid, and that there might be a path to contesting the sale. May sat very still through all of it. When Eliza was done, May said, "Art signed those papers voluntarily." "Under duress created by fraud," Eliza said. "That's different from a clean transaction. Harriet Frame, the lawyer who filed the complaint, she said it's not a simple path, but it's not a closed one either." May was quiet for a long moment. "He cried," she said finally. "Art. When he signed. He went into the barn afterward and I could hear him, and I stood outside because I didn't know what to do with it." She stopped. 40 years, that land. Eliza didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say to 40 years. "What do we do?" May said. "Get your deed and the original sale documents," Eliza said, "and come to Harriet Frame's office in Mill Haven. I'll send a wire today to let her know you're coming." She paused. "Don't go to the county office here. Go directly to Mill Haven." May looked at her. "Because of Sutter." "Yes," Eliza said. May stood up, straightening like something in her spine had decided to hold firm again. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. "I know where Art keeps the lockbox." Eliza waited in the yard. The late morning wind moved through the empty pasture where the Henderson cattle had grazed, and the quiet of it was the particular quiet of a place where the living things had been taken out, and nothing had replaced them yet. She thought about Everett Holloway. She thought about the notebook he'd had in his hand the afternoon she'd walked him through her operation, the careful attention he'd paid to everything she said. She had taken that for respect. She had let herself take it for respect because it had been so long since anyone had paid attention to what she knew that she'd misread the nature of his interest. That was the part that sat badly. Not the fraud. The fraud she could fight. It was the fact that she'd been lonely enough, for long enough, to almost fall for the performance of being seen. May came back in 8 minutes with a worn leather satchel under her arm and her coat buttoned to the collar. "Art's going to want to hear this himself," she said. "Can I bring him to Mill Haven?" "Bring him," Eliza said. She rode back toward town faster than she'd ridden out, with one eye on the road ahead and one part of her mind on what Holloway's man riding south might mean. South was Helena. Helena was where the territorial marshal's office was. She'd assumed that Harriet Frame filing there would put the complaint beyond Holloway's reach, but that assumed Holloway didn't have connections in Helena, which was an assumption she was no longer comfortable making about a man who had apparently been running this scheme across multiple counties without anyone stopping him. She needed to talk to Harriet. She needed to do it today, before Holloway could interfere with the filing. She found Caleb at her ranch when she got back, as she'd started to expect. He was in the barn with Gus, working on a section of stall wall that had been loose for 2 weeks. She stood in the barn doorway and watched them for a moment, Caleb holding the board in place while Gus drove the nails with the precise economy of a man who'd been doing it for 50 years, and felt something catch in her chest that she deliberately walked through rather than around. "I need to ride to Millhaven," she said. Both men looked at her. "Today," she said. "Right now." Caleb set down the board. "What happened?" She told him about Cruz riding south and what it might mean. He listened with his hands at his sides and his eyes on her face. "He's got people in Helena," Caleb said when she was done. "I don't know that," she said, "but I'm not willing to assume otherwise." "How long has Harriet been on the road?" "She left around 10:30, Eliza said. "She's ahead of Cruz by probably 2 hours if Cruz rode straight through. But Holloway knew about the filing before she left, which means if he had a faster route or a telegraph—" "The telegraph office," Caleb said. She stopped. The telegraph office in Dustvale. She'd walked past it this morning without thinking about it. Holloway had resources she'd been calculating only in terms of legal maneuvering, but he had money, and money meant communication networks. And communication networks meant the gap between Harriet Frame's 2-hour head start and whatever Holloway could set in motion might be narrower than she'd assumed. "Who runs the telegraph here?" she said. "Parsons," Gus said, still holding his hammer. "Billy Parsons. He's honest, but he talks." "Who does he talk to?" Gus scratched the side of his jaw. "Everybody," he said. "But his wife works at the hotel, and Holloway's been staying at the hotel." Eliza turned to Caleb. "I need you to go to the telegraph office," she said. "I need to know if any wires went out this morning from Holloway, or anyone connected to him. Parsons won't show you the content, but he'll tell you if wires were sent if you frame it the right way." "How do I frame it the right way?" Caleb said. "Tell him you're trying to settle a property dispute, and you need to know if any filings were contested this morning," she said. Which is true. And it's the kind of thing he'd think was routine. Caleb looked at her with the expression he sometimes wore when he was both impressed and slightly alarmed by how quickly she assembled these things. "And you?" he said. "I'm going to Millhaven," she said. "I'll send Gus to warn the Bellamy and Carver families to watch for any visitors they don't recognize before I leave." Gus was already setting down the hammer. "Don't do anything confrontational," she told Gus. "Just go. Tell them to sit tight until they hear from me." "I know how to deliver a message," Gus said, with the mildness of a man who had been delivering messages competently for 6 decades. "I know," she said. "Sorry." She was already moving to saddle her horse. Caleb touched her arm as she passed him. Not grabbing, just touching. A light, quick contact at her elbow that made her stop. "Be careful on the road," he said. "You said that before," she said. "I meant it then too," he said. She looked at him for 1 second, and then she said, "Telegraph office. Go now," and walked past him to her horse. She made Millhaven in under 2 hours, pushing her horse harder than she should have on the second half of the ride. She found Harriet Frame's office above the dry goods store, climbed the creaking stairs, and knocked without waiting to catch her breath. Harriet opened the door. She took one look at Eliza's face and stepped back. "Did you file it?" Eliza said. "Agnes rode to the marshal's office an hour ago with the full submission," Harriet said. "It's been received and signed for. I have the receipt." She moved to her desk and held up a piece of paper. "It's on record, Eliza. He can't pull it." Eliza stood in the doorway and let that settle. "Are you sure Agnes got through?" she said. "No one stopped her?" Harriet frowned. "She walked 4 blocks and handed it to a desk clerk," she said. "What happened?" Eliza came in and sat down and explained about Cruz riding south. Harriet listened, and when Eliza was done, she sat back in her chair and pressed her lips together in the expression of someone recalibrating risk. "If Holloway has contacts in the marshal's office," Harriet said carefully, "they can't suppress a formal complaint that's been received and receipted. That's a matter of record now. What they could do is slow the investigation, delay assignment of a marshal, create bureaucratic friction that gives Holloway time to restructure," Eliza said. "Move assets, transfer what he's already acquired." "Potentially," Harriet said, "which is why I think we shouldn't wait for the investigation to produce results before we take a second step." Eliza looked at her. "What second step?" "The territorial governor's office," Harriet said. I have a direct contact there, a man named Forsyth who handles land disputes at the executive level. If I send him a summary of this case with the supporting documentation, he can apply pressure from above the marshal's office. It removes the single point of failure. Can you reach him today? By wire, Harriet said, and by post. I'll send both. Do it, Eliza said. Harriet was already pulling paper from her desk. Eliza sat across from her and watched her write, and while she watched, she thought about how strange this was. To be sitting in a lawyer's office in Mill Haven, with the machinery of territorial law actually moving in the direction she'd pointed it, when 4 days ago she'd been alone at her kitchen table with a folder of documents and no clear sense of whether any of it would matter. The Hendersons, she said. May Henderson is coming to see you, her and her husband. The sale they made, what are the realistic odds? Harriet kept writing without looking up. If the sale was induced by a fraudulent tax obligation, and what you've given me suggests it was, then there's legal ground to argue that the transaction was conducted under material misrepresentation. She paused. Realistically, given a sympathetic judge, I'd say better than even odds of reversal. Less realistic if Holloway's already transferred or mortgaged the property. He's had 2 months, Eliza said. Yes, Harriet said. That's the risk. She finished the line she was writing and looked up. But 2 months isn't enough time to complete most transfers of that scale if there are any financing complications. And I'll wager a man running this kind of scheme in multiple counties is carrying more debt than his public face suggests. Eliza thought about that. About the kind of ambition that builds fraud across an entire valley. About whether a man who went to all that trouble was the kind who had solid capital behind him, or the kind who was leveraged on his expected gains. His notebook, she said, half to herself. Harriet looked at her. What? When he walked my ranch, Eliza said, he was taking notes on the operation, the pasture rotation, the water access, the cattle records. I was assessing value. She paused. He needed the land to be worth what he was calculating. If his projections were based on the actual operations of these ranches, then the assets he pledged against his expansion financing are producing cattle operations, Harriet said slowly, not vacant lots. If those operations disappear, if the ranchers stop working the land because they think they've lost it, the actual value collapses, Eliza said, which might explain why he's been in a hurry, why he pushed me with that document when I didn't move fast enough. She was working through it as she said it, the shape of Holloway's entire scheme clarifying. He's not just stealing land, he's stealing the value of what's on it. Which means he's exposed, Harriet said. If the land transfers don't go through, or if they're reversed, the financing he's built on top of them becomes unstable. He's in a bind, Eliza said. That's why he's going to come at me hard. Harriet looked at her steadily. You expected that. I've been expecting that since Wednesday morning, Eliza said. I just didn't know exactly what form it would take. She rode back to Dustvale in the late afternoon with a clearer picture of what was coming and a tighter feeling in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Caleb was waiting at the ranch, as she'd known he would be. He met her at the gate before she'd dismounted. 3 wires went out of Dustvale this morning, he said. Parsons confirmed it without much trouble. 1 to Helena, 1 to a legal office in Denver, and 1 to an address in Billings that he described as a private residence. Helena and Denver I expected, she said, climbing down. Billings is interesting. It's where Holloway has another operation, Caleb said. I checked. He's been buying up there too, but nothing's been formalized yet. He paused. Could be he's calling in support. Could be he's looking for an exit. She handed him her horse's reins without thinking about it, the way you hand things to someone you've trusted long enough to stop making conscious decisions about. I talked to Harriet, she said. She's sending to the governor's office today. The complaint is already on record. She pulled her coat tighter. He can't kill this legally. Which means he might try something that isn't legal, Caleb said, not a question. He already tried something that wasn't legal, she said. He's been doing it for months. The difference is, now he knows we know. They walked to the house together. Gus was back. She could hear him in the barn, and the smell of something on the stove came through the door, which meant Percy had gotten ambitious, which happened occasionally and was sometimes fine and sometimes catastrophic. Inside, Percy was standing over the stove with the focused expression of a man who had committed to a course of action he wasn't entirely sure of. He was 68, and had been on this ranch longer than Eliza had been alive. He said nothing when they came in, which meant he'd already been briefed by Gus and had decided that feeding people was his contribution to the current crisis. Eliza sat at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and thought. Caleb sat across from her and let her think, which was something she'd come to understand was not a small thing. Not everyone could sit in silence while someone else worked through a problem without filling the space with their own noise. He's going to try to discredit the evidence, she said after a few minutes. That's the cleanest move. If he can get someone to challenge the authenticity of the county documents. Marsh has the originals, Caleb said. Marsh and Harriet, she said, and I have copies, and the ranchers have their own deeds. She tapped the table. He can't scrub it all. There's too much of it in too many places. So what else does he have? Caleb said. She'd been working toward this thought since the road back from Mill Haven. He could try to buy silence, she said. Go back to the ranchers individually and offer settlements before the investigation can proceed. Get them to drop out of the complaint. Caleb considered that. You think any of them would take it? Frank Dunnigan might, she said honestly. He came on board because I convinced him, but he's still afraid, and Walt Carver's been nervous since Tuesday. She looked at her hands. If Holloway comes to them with a clean check and a promise of no further trouble, then we need to get to them first, Caleb said. Tonight. She looked at him. That's a lot of writing. We've been doing a lot of writing, he said. She held his gaze across the table. Outside, the wind was picking up and the early dark of October was coming down over the mountains, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and whatever Percy was managing on the stove, and it was the most ordinary moment in the middle of the least ordinary week of her life. You don't have to keep doing this, she said. This isn't your fight. I have a ranch in this valley, he said. Holloway hasn't touched yours. Not yet, he said, and even if he never would. He stopped, started over. Eliza, you came to my door on a Sunday night with a piece of paper and a look on your face that meant you'd already decided what had to be done. You just needed someone to go with you. He met her eyes directly, no careful containment, just straight. I want to be that person. Not because you need me to be, because I want to be. The kitchen was very quiet, except for Percy's occasional sound effects from the stove. She looked at Caleb Westbrook across her kitchen table and she thought about 3 years of Thursdays, 3 years of lists and wagon routes and careful distance, and she thought about how tired she was. Not from this week's work, but from the longer exhaustion of holding everything at arm's length, because letting it closer had always felt like a risk she couldn't afford. After this is done, she said. After this is done, he agreed, but I'm still coming tonight. They ate quickly. Percy's stew was surprisingly good, which Gus seemed personally offended by. Then Eliza split the list. She and Caleb would each take half the ranchers, covering more ground in less time. They agreed to meet back at her ranch by midnight and compare what they'd found. She took Frank Dunnigan first because he was the one she was most worried about. She arrived at his place at full dark, and the light in his window told her he was still up. He opened the door fast when she knocked, which meant he'd heard the horse and was already alert. Someone came, he said, before she could speak. She went cold. When? About an hour ago, he said. One man. Said he was from Holloway's office. Said that the legal action I'd been drawn into was based on bad information and that Mr. Holloway wanted to offer me a good faith settlement to avoid further complications. What did you say? She said. He looked at her steadily, this worn and contrary old man who had spent 3 years trusting nobody. I told him to get off my land, he said. She exhaled. He said he'd come back, Dunnigan added. Said I had until tomorrow to think about it. He doesn't have the standing to make that offer, Eliza said. Once a formal complaint is filed with the territorial marshal, individual settlements can't quietly make it go away. It's on record. I know that, he said, or I figured it, but I wanted you to know he'd been here. How many of the others do you think he visited tonight? She said. Dunnigan considered. He only had one man I could see, he said. He can't have gotten to all of them. She was already thinking through the geography. Caleb was covering the north properties. She'd taken the south. If Holloway had one man going door to door tonight. Do you have anyone who can stay with you tonight? She said. He gave her a look. I'm 63 years old, he said. I've been alone here for 11 years. I don't need a sitter. I know, she said. I'm asking because I want to know you'll send word if that man comes back. If he comes back, Dunnigan said, I'll send word. She believed him. She covered the rest of her half of the list in the next 2 hours. The Bellamys had not been visited. The Carvers had. Walt confirmed it, nervous and unhappy, but Dora had apparently shown the man out herself with very little ceremony, which made Eliza appreciate Dora Carver more than she already had. The young Marsh family hadn't had a visit, but Daniel had been watching the road and had noted a rider passing twice without stopping, which suggested their place had been assessed and passed over. Maybe because a family with a 17-year-old who drove to the county office in the dark was more trouble than it was worth. She got back to her ranch at 11:40. Caleb arrived 15 minutes later, and his face when he came through the gate told her something had happened. She met him at the barn. "Pete Sutton," he said, dismounting. "Someone tried to get into his place tonight." She went still. "Tried?" "Pete heard them and came out with a rifle," Caleb said. "Nobody was hurt, and whoever it was left fast. But it wasn't a conversation. It wasn't someone coming to make an offer." He paused. "It was someone trying to get inside the house." Eliza thought about what was inside Pete Sutton's house. Pete Sutton, who had walked a mile on foot this morning to stand in the county records office, was probably carrying his deed and his tax documents the same way all of them were. "He wanted the documents," she said. "Or he wanted to know what Pete had," Caleb said. "Either way, that's different from sending a man to make settlement offers." "He's escalating," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. They stood in the barn in the dark, with the horses shifting in their stalls and the cold coming through the boards. And Eliza looked at the floor for a moment and ran through everything: the filing, the governor's office wire, the documents distributed across a dozen locations, the signed affidavits. "He can't get it back," she said. "Even if he took every document from every ranch tonight, it wouldn't undo the filing. Harriet has copies. The marshal's office has the submission." "He knows that," Caleb said. "So why is he doing this?" She looked up. "Because he's panicking," she said. "Because rational men with solid legal and financial positions don't send someone to break into Pete Sutton's house. They wait for their lawyers." She paused. "He's not in as strong a position as he wants us to think." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's good," he said. "It's also dangerous," she said. "Panicking men make decisions that stable men don't." He nodded slowly. "Do you want me to stay tonight?" She almost said she was fine. It was the reflex of 4 years of being fine by herself. But she thought about Holloway's man on the road and whatever had been intended at Pete Sutton's house, and she thought about the folder of original documents still in her desk drawer, and she said, "Yes, the spare room." He didn't make anything of it, just nodded and began unsaddling his horse. She went inside, checked the doors, and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low. The house was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard the way it always did at this hour, finding the gaps in the fencing and the loose board on the barn and the post her father had driven into the ground that had been leaning 2 degrees west for as long as she could remember. She had been afraid, she realized. Not in a way that had stopped her, but afraid nonetheless. Of losing the land, of being too late, of the whole thing unraveling because she'd missed something, or moved too slowly, or trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment. She was still afraid, but it was a different shape now, less like the ground giving way and more like a current, something moving under the surface that she was in, that she couldn't stop, but that was going somewhere. The filing was done. The evidence was distributed. The governor's office had been contacted. The ranchers were holding, and Everett Holloway, who had come into this valley, assuming no one would look closely enough to find him, was sending men to knock on doors at night because the ground under his scheme was moving too. She turned the lamp down further. She sat in the dark a while longer, listening to the house. Then she heard Caleb come in from the barn and move through the kitchen to the spare room, and the small domestic sound of it, boots on the floor, the door closing quietly, settled something in her that she hadn't been aware was unsettled. She went to bed. She slept. She woke before sunrise, which was not unusual, but the first thing she heard was the spare room door and the sound of Caleb already moving in the kitchen, which was unusual, and it took her a half-second to remember why he was there before the whole weight of the week came back. She lay still for a moment and let it. Then she got up. He had made coffee. It was strong and slightly too hot, and she drank it at the kitchen table while the gray pre-dawn light came through the window, and he sat across from her with his own cup, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was the kind of silence that had stopped feeling awkward somewhere in the last 4 days, and had become something else. Something load-bearing, like a wall that didn't need decorating because it was doing real work just by being there. Marshall's office will have had the complaint for almost 20 hours, Caleb said finally. Yes, she said. How long before they act? Harriet said a week was the formal window, she said. But if the governor's office weighed in, she stopped. She didn't know. She'd never done anything like this before. None of the framework she'd built for managing the ranch, for managing the 1,000 daily problems of keeping something alive on thin margins, had a section for how long territorial law took to move. What do we do today, Sec? He said. We wait, she said. We stay close, and we make sure everyone else stays steady. He nodded. Dunnigan's the one I'm most worried about, she said. He's alone out there, and that man is coming back today. I'll go to him this morning, Caleb said. I can stay there through the afternoon. She looked at him across the table. In the gray kitchen light, he looked tired, properly tired, the same tiredness she felt, and she found she was glad to see it, not because she wanted him exhausted, but because it was real. It meant he'd actually been here, actually doing this, and it hadn't cost him nothing. All right, she said. Gus appeared at 6, looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the world and had simply decided to manage it, and started making breakfast without comment. Percy came in from the barn at 6:30 and announced that the roan gelding had thrown a shoe and would need the farrier, which under any other circumstance would have been the day's primary concern, and the mundane normality of it almost made Eliza laugh. She didn't laugh, but she wanted to, which felt like a sign that she had not entirely lost perspective. She spent the morning at her desk. She went through the documents one more time, not because she expected to find something new, but because reviewing what she had helped her think, the same way some people paced or chopped wood. She made a clean copy of the timeline she'd been assembling in her head since Sunday night. Every date, every filing, every visit from Holloway, every amendment, the sequence of it laid out in her own handwriting so clearly that it told its own story without any interpretation required. She sent Gus into town at 9 with 2 errands. The first was to check whether anything had come through the telegraph office for her. The second was to walk past the hotel and see whether Holloway's horse was still at the hitching post. Gus came back at 10:15. One wire had come for her. It was from Harriet Frame, and it said, Forsyth confirmed receipt. Governor's office has requested priority review from Marshall's district superintendent. You should expect contact within 48 hours. 48 hours. 2 days. She read it twice and then folded it and put it in the folder with everything else. Holloway's horse was not at the hotel. He checked out, she said. Billy Parsons' wife told me he checked out this morning, Gus said. Early. Before breakfast. She sat with that for a moment. A man checking out of his hotel could mean he was running. It could mean he'd moved to a different position. It could mean his operation here was finished one way or another, and he was retreating to manage the fallout from somewhere else. Or it could mean he'd simply decided to do whatever came next from outside Dustvale, where there were fewer eyes on him. She sent a wire to Harriet immediately. Holloway has left Dustvale. Unknown destination. Please notify Marshall's office. Then she sat at her desk and made herself think carefully about what a panicking man with resources did when he realized the walls were closing. He didn't disappear. Disappearing abandoned what he'd built. He had properties he had already acquired. He had financing structures that required management. He had, Harriet had suggested, debt against expected gains, which meant creditors who would not appreciate a sudden silence. He was going to try one more thing. She was almost sure of it. She just didn't know what. She found out at 2 in the afternoon when Ruth Bellamy rode into her yard at a pace that meant something was wrong. Ruth dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, which was the kind of thing a person did when they were holding themselves together through movement and didn't dare slow down. He came to us this morning, Ruth said. Holloway himself, not his man. Him. Eliza came off the porch. What did he say? He said the legal action is going to fail, Ruth said. He said he has lawyers who will demonstrate that the property amendments were conducted through proper channels and that any claims of fraud are based on a misunderstanding of territorial survey law. She stopped. He said if we withdrew our affidavit by tonight, he'd cancel our tax notice and walk away. No further action. He said the same to Jack. Jack was in the barn, Ruth said. I talked to him myself. Her jaw was tight. He was calm. That's what got to me. He was perfectly calm, like he was discussing the weather, like he still believed he was in control of this. Eliza looked at her steadily. Are you withdrawing? Ruth gave her a look that could have stripped paint. I rode 11 miles to tell you this, she said. What do you think? I think you didn't, Eliza said. I didn't, Ruth confirmed, but I want to know if what he said is true. About the lawyers. About the amendments being defensible. This was the moment Eliza had been quietly preparing for, the moment when fear came back dressed in the reasonable clothing of legal uncertainty. She could feel it, the pull of it, even from where she was standing, even though she wasn't the one Holloway had spoken to this morning. He's trying to create doubt, Eliza said, because doubt is the only thing he has left. She spoke carefully, not rushing it, because Ruth Bellamy deserved the truth not delivered fast. The Western Territory Land Assessment Company is registered at a non-existent address. That's not a technicality. That's the foundation of his entire filing structure, and it doesn't hold up. A lawyer can argue a lot of things in this territory, but they cannot argue that a company operating from a vacant lot in Helena is a legitimate survey authority. Ruth was quiet. Harriet Frame filed with the governor's office yesterday, Eliza said. The marshal's district superintendent has been asked for a priority review. That's not a process a team of lawyers can talk their way around in an afternoon. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Her face was doing the complicated work of sorting fear from reason, which was not easy and was not fast, and Eliza waited. What if the other families withdraw, Ruth said. If enough of them pull their affidavits. The county records still exist, Eliza said. The registration certificate still exists. The complaint is already filed. Individual affidavits strengthen the case, but the foundational evidence stands without them. She paused. He needs us to panic. That's the only move he has, so we don't panic. Ruth looked at the ground for a moment, then she looked back up. All right, she said. What do I do if he comes back? Tell him your position hasn't changed, Eliza said, and tell him the same thing I'm about to tell anyone else he visits today. Ruth waited. Tell him the affidavits have already been submitted, Eliza said, and that the time for quiet settlements has passed. Ruth left 20 minutes later, steadier than she'd arrived, and Eliza went back inside and tried to think about what else Holloway had done this morning besides visit the Bellamys. He'd left the hotel early. He'd visited Ruth. How many others had he gotten to before the news of his checkout spread? She needed Caleb. She sent Percy to Dunnigan's place to fetch him. Not urgently, just a message to come back when he could. Percy moved slower than Gus on a good day, but he was reliable and he knew the roads. While she waited, she did something she'd been putting off. She saddled up and rode to the Pruitt place. The Pruitts, Martin and Clara, had sold 2 months ago. They'd moved to their daughter's house in town, and the ranch had been sitting quiet, nominally under Holloway's land company, while the paperwork processed. She'd been thinking about them the same way she'd been thinking about the Hendersons, as part of what this fight was actually about, beyond her own 240 acres. Martin Pruitt answered the door at his daughter's house looking like a man who had aged a year for every week since the sale. He was 64, heavyset, with hands that looked wrong without work in them. She told him what she'd told May Henderson, the fraudulent company, the complaint, the governor's office, the possibility, not a promise, not a certainty, but a real possibility, of contesting the transaction. Martin sat down heavily in a chair in his daughter's front room and put his face in his hands for a moment, and Eliza sat across from him and waited. He looked up. His eyes were red. We didn't have to sell, he said. It wasn't a question. Not on those terms, she said. No. He looked at his hands. Clara doesn't know about any of this, he said. She took it hard. I didn't want to. He stopped. You don't have to tell her anything yet, Eliza said. Let Harriet Frame start the process. If it goes the way it should, then you'll have something concrete to tell her. And if it doesn't go the way it should? She looked at him directly. Then at least you'll know it wasn't your fault, she said. It was never your fault. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. And the information was wrong because someone put it there wrong deliberately. Martin was quiet for a long moment. What do I do? He said. Come to Harriet Frame's office in Mill Haven, she said. Bring your sale documents and your original deed. Let her see what there is to work with. He nodded slowly. When? Monday, she said. I'll send a wire to let her know you're coming." She rode back to her ranch in the mid-afternoon and found Caleb there when she arrived, which meant Percy had reached him faster than she expected. He was in the yard with Gus when she came through the gate, and he looked at her with the particular attention she'd gotten used to. Not scrutiny, just a quality of focus that meant he was reading how she was doing before she said anything. "Holloway went to the Bellamy's this morning," she said, "and probably others. He's making a last run at pulling affidavits." She told him everything Ruth had said, and he listened with his arms crossed. And when she was done, he said, "Dunnigan's holding. The man came back this morning like he said he would, and Frank met him at the gate with his dog and an expression that apparently communicated his position pretty clearly." Something in her chest loosened slightly. "Good," she said. "He said something interesting, though," Caleb said. "Dunnigan. He said Holloway's man was nervous, not confident, nervous." She turned that over. "Because Holloway knows it's over," she said. "He's going through the motions because he doesn't have anything better to do." "Or because he's stalling," Caleb said. "Buying time for something." "What does he have left to buy time for?" she said. Neither of them had an answer to that immediately. But the question sat between them with an uncomfortable weight, because the honest answer was that she didn't know everything Everett Holloway had, and she'd made a mistake earlier this week thinking she understood the full shape of what she was dealing with. She'd been right about enough of it. She hadn't been right about all of it. The marshal arrived on Friday. Not the district superintendent, a deputy marshal named Cole. Young, which was initially discouraging, and then immediately more encouraging when he opened his saddlebag and produced a copy of Harriet Frame's submission with handwritten margin notes covering every page, which suggested someone senior had read it very carefully before deciding who to send. He came to the Monroe Ranch because her name was on the complaint, and she invited him inside and gave him coffee and answered every question he asked with the folder open on the table between them. He spent 3 hours at her kitchen table. He asked about the filings, about Sutter, about the Western Territory Land Assessment Company, about Holloway's visits, about the deed transfer document she'd refused to sign. He asked about Daniel Marsh's discovery regarding the Helena address, and she gave him Daniel's name and the Marsh family's location without hesitation. When he was done, he closed his notebook and looked at her. "Miss Monroe," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you. We've had an inquiry open on Holloway's land activities in 2 other counties for the past 6 weeks. What you've brought us is the first documentation with enough specificity to move forward." She looked at him. "2 other counties," she said. "This isn't the only valley," he said. "It's the one where somebody actually built the case." She sat with that for a moment. 2 other counties. How many more properties? How many other families who'd gotten notices they couldn't account for and had simply sold because the pressure was real and the resources to fight it weren't? "What happens now?" she said. "I ride to speak to Deputy Clerk Sutter this afternoon," he said, "and I'll be sending correspondence to Holloway's last known location. We have an obligation to notify him of the investigation before we take further steps." "He's left Dustvale," she said. "I know," Cole said, "but he hasn't gone far." He paused, in the way of someone sharing more than they technically had to. "He checked into a hotel in Billings 2 days ago." Billings. The wire Holloway had sent. The second operation that hadn't been formalized yet. "He's trying to salvage the Billings acquisition," she said. Coles didn't confirm or deny, but his expression said she was probably right. "Will the Dustvale properties be protected while the investigation proceeds?" she said. "Nobody should be losing their land based on those amendments while this is open." "I can issue a stay on any property transfers connected to the Western Territory Land Assessment Company filings," Coles said. "As of today, nothing moves." She nodded. He left. She stood on the porch and watched his horse until it was out of sight, and then she went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and stayed there for a while without doing anything. Caleb came in from the barn about 10 minutes later. He looked at her face and sat down across from her. "He's going to investigate," she said. 2 other counties. He's been doing this in 2 other counties." Caleb was quiet. "There are more families," she said, "who didn't have what these families had, who didn't have someone come to their door and tell them the tax notice was fraudulent." She looked at the table. "They just lost their land." "You couldn't have known," he said. "I know I couldn't have known," she said. "I'm not saying I should have. I'm just—" She stopped. "I'm just sitting with it." He didn't try to move her past it. That was the right thing to do. Some things needed to be sat with before they could be set down, and he seemed to understand that in the particular way that not many people did. After a while, she said, "He'll go after the Billings acquisition." "Coles will be watching for it," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "And Harriet's already made contact with the governor's office. If Holloway tries to formalize anything in Billings while an active investigation is open, he's going to be doing it with a lot of eyes on him." She looked up. "He's done. He doesn't know how done he is yet, but he's done." The investigation moved faster than 48 hours had suggested, in the way that things sometimes move faster when the pressure applied to them is coming from two directions at once. The governor's office and the marshal's district superintendent had apparently had a productive exchange that neither Eliza nor Harriet was privy to, but the practical result was visible within the week. Holloway was formally notified of the investigation on Saturday. By Monday, Harriet had received confirmation that all property transfers connected to the Western Territory Land Assessment Company filings were stayed pending investigation in 3 counties. By Wednesday of the following week, a second deputy marshal had ridden to Billings, and whatever was happening in Holloway's hotel room up there became, by all available evidence, significantly less comfortable. The news arrived to Dustvale in fragments, the way news travels in a small town. A wire here, a letter there, a deputy passing through who mentioned something to someone who mentioned it to someone else. Ordell Marsh, who had become quietly and unexpectedly important through the whole proceeding, turned out to have a brother-in-law in Helena who worked at the territorial courthouse, and the information that came through that channel was detailed, if not always timely. Deputy Clerk Sutter resigned from the county office on the Tuesday after Cole's visit. He did not leave Dustvale immediately, but he spent the following weeks looking like a man who was counting the days until he could, and nobody made it comfortable for him in the meantime. The fraudulent amendments to 6 property records were formally voided in the 3rd week of October, which meant the corresponding tax notices were invalid, which meant the affected ranchers owed nothing on the fabricated acreage. The relief this produced was different for each family. The Bellamys were quiet about it. Pete Sutton said nothing publicly but was seen buying around at the saloon for the first time in 4 years. Frank Dunnigan told anyone who asked that he'd known something was wrong from the start, which was not entirely accurate but was close enough. The Henderson and Pruitt sales were more complicated, as Harriet had said they would be. The process of contesting completed transactions under duress took months, not weeks, and required filings that Harriet managed with the careful patience of someone who understood that the law moved at its own pace, regardless of how urgently justice demanded otherwise. But by December, a territorial judge had agreed to hear both cases under the fraud provisions Harriet had argued, and Art Henderson, who had cried alone in his barn the day he signed those papers, came to find Eliza at her ranch one evening to say that there was going to be a hearing, and he understood they had a real chance. He stood in her yard with his hat in his hands, this 60-year-old rancher who had given everything he had to a piece of Montana ground that someone had tried to take from him with paperwork and presumption, and he said, "I don't know how to thank you." She looked at him. She thought about what to say, and what she settled on was the truth. "Thank the boy," she said. "Daniel Marsh. He was the one who remembered the address." Art looked confused for a moment. Then something in his face softened. "I'll do that," he said. Everett Holloway was formally charged in November with fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and filing false instruments in a territorial proceeding. The charges came from 3 counties, which made the structure of what he'd been building visible all at once. Not just a scheme in one valley, but a coordinated operation across a significant stretch of Montana territory, designed to convert working ranch land into speculative holdings at a fraction of its real value by destroying the legal standing of the people who owned it. His lawyers were good, they were expensive and experienced, and they argued every technical point available to them, and the case took longer to resolve than anyone wanted it to. But Harriet Frame had built a foundation from Eliza's documentation that was specific and cross-referenced and grounded in hard evidence, and the lawyers, for all their skill, were working against something that had too many independent pieces to undermine cleanly. He was convicted the following spring. Eliza didn't go to the courthouse for it. She heard about it from Caleb, who had ridden into town that morning for other reasons and stopped at the telegraph office on his way back. He came through her gate in the late afternoon, and she knew from the way he was riding, not urgently, just with a certain directness, that he had something to tell her. She was at the fence she'd been meaning to properly repair for a month, doing the actual work of it now that the crisis had loosened its grip on every hour of her day. He dismounted and walked over and said, "It's done." She set down her tools. "Convicted on all counts," he said. "Sentencing next month." She nodded. They stood at the fence in the spring afternoon, with the pasture green for the first time since the story started, the cattle visible at the far end, the mountains still holding snow on their upper reaches. The sky was the particular blue of a Montana spring, not soft, not delicate, but enormous and absolute. The kind of sky that made everything under it feel both very small and exactly the right size. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She picked up the fence tool again. He watched her for a moment, then went to the other end of the section she was working and held the rail in place without being asked, because he knew where everything went on this ranch, and they worked in silence for a while. That was months after the night he'd slept in her spare room and the morning they'd shared coffee in the gray pre-dawn quiet. The conversation about the space between them had waited, as she'd said it would, through the investigation and the filings and the two families whose sales were still being contested and the 100 smaller things that the aftermath of all of it required. It hadn't been a clean waiting. They'd argued twice, once about whether she should ride alone to Mill Haven for a meeting with Harriet when the roads were bad, once about something so small she couldn't precisely remember what it was afterward, only that it had been about the small thing on the surface and about the much larger thing underneath. And they'd both said things that were too sharp, and then come back to it the next day and worked through it without pretending the sharpness hadn't happened. That was how she knew it was real, not the easy parts, the fact that the difficult parts hadn't broken it. One evening in early April, she was going over the spring cattle records at the kitchen table when he came in from the barn and sat down across from her the way he always did with his own cup of coffee, and he looked at her for a moment and said, "I've been patient." She looked up from the ledger. "Yes," she said. "You have." "I'm not complaining about it," he said. "I'm noting it." "I know," she said. He looked at her steadily. "This is me asking," he said. "Clearly. No room for misunderstanding." She closed the ledger. "I know this ranch comes first," he said. "I know you don't need a partner in the way people usually mean it. I know you've built something here that's yours, completely yours, and I'm not asking you to make it anything else." He stopped. "I'm asking if there's room for me in it, not to run it, not to protect it, just to be part of it, with you." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the spring evening was cooling toward night, and the first frogs from the creek were starting up, which was the sound that meant winter was finally done. She thought about the night she'd ridden to his door with a tax notice in her hand, and he'd said, "Come in," without asking why. She thought about 3 years of Thursdays, and the careful distance they'd both maintained and how tired she'd been of it, without knowing how to say so. She thought about the 2 arguments, and the coming back from them, and the coffee in the gray light, and the fence rail he held in place without being asked. She thought about what it cost a person to ask clearly, with no room for misunderstanding, when they'd spent years being careful. "There's room," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Just that. Looked at her, without the carefulness in it this time. "All right," he said. They didn't make a production of it. That wasn't who either of them was. He stayed for supper, which had become common enough that Gus set a place for him without being told. And afterward they sat on the porch in the cooling evening and talked about the spring cattle market and whether the east pasture needed reseeding and whether the farrier had done right by the roan gelding's shoe. Ordinary things. The ordinary things of a life, shared. They married in June in the yard of the Monroe Ranch, with Gus and Percy and the Bellamys and the Carvers and Daniel Marsh and his family and Art and May Henderson and old Frank Dunnigan all present, and Harriet Frame rode up from Mill Haven and stood in the back with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looking like a woman who had earned the right to attend something good. It was a plain ceremony, no performances. Eliza wore a dress she'd had for years and hadn't found the occasion for, and Caleb wore his good coat, and they said what needed to be said in front of the people who had been part of what this place had become, and that was enough. Afterward, Pete Sutton ate 3 plates of food and didn't say much, which for Pete Sutton was an expression of profound contentment. In the years that followed, the Monroe Ranch, which they kept under that name, because it was her father's land and that didn't change just because she shared it, became one of the most consistently productive cattle operations in the Dust Vale Valley. Not the largest, not the most celebrated, but the kind of operation that other ranchers came to look at when they were trying to figure out a problem with their pasture rotation, or their water management, or their breeding records, because the woman who ran it kept meticulous notes and had an approach that actually worked, and she would explain it to anyone who asked without making them feel small for asking. The Henderson property was returned to Art in May by territorial court order in the fall. The Pruitt case settled the following spring, with Martin and Clara Pruitt reclaiming their deed and their land. Both families went back to work. Not without scars. The Hendersons had lost 10 months of operating income, and the Pruitts had burned through savings they'd spent years building, and those losses were real and didn't evaporate just because the land came back. But they came back, and that was not a small thing. Deputy Sutter left Montana Territory entirely. Nobody heard from him again, and nobody asked after him, and the general consensus in Dust Vale was that the county office worked better without him, which it did. Ordell Marsh served another 8 years as county clerk. He processed every document with the same care he'd always brought to the job, except that after the winter of Eliza Monroe's tax notice, he checked the registration status of every company that filed survey amendments, without exception, and never processed an irregular filing again without written authorization from 2 independent sources. Daniel Marsh went to law school. This happened partly because Harriet Frame, after meeting him in the county office that Wednesday morning, sent him a letter 6 months later telling him he should, and partly because he had remembered an address on a piece of paper on a cold night and ridden 11 miles in the dark to tell someone about it, and understood, after that, what it felt like when a small thing you noticed turned out to matter. Eliza thought about all of this sometimes, not often, because there was too much present tense to dwell much in the past. But sometimes, when the morning was quiet and the ranch was doing what it was supposed to do, and Caleb was out in the yard and the light was coming over the mountains the way it did in Montana when the weather was right, she thought about what it cost to stay. Not just in that specific week with those specific documents and those specific stakes, but in general. The daily cost of staying somewhere and building something and refusing to let the weight of being underestimated be the thing that defined you. It was a real cost. It came out of you in ways you didn't always track and sometimes couldn't afford and couldn't always justify to anyone else, including yourself. She thought about the people who hadn't stayed, the ones who had sold not because a man tricked them, but because the cost of staying had simply exceeded what they had left. She didn't judge them. She'd been closer to that edge than she'd admitted to anyone. There had been a Tuesday, 2 years before Holloway came, when the accounts were so thin and the work was so relentless, and the loneliness was so steady and complete that she'd sat at this same kitchen table at 2 in the morning and thought seriously about letting it go, about selling and going somewhere else and becoming someone for whom this particular weight was no longer something to carry. She hadn't, not for any grand reason, partly stubbornness, partly the fact that she genuinely didn't know who she would be without this land, and the uncertainty of that had felt more frightening than the exhaustion. But she understood the people who made the other choice. She thought that was important to understand, that staying was not the only honorable option, and that the ones who left were not failures. Sometimes the bravest thing a person did was recognize that a fight wasn't theirs to win alone and put it down. What she had was luck, in addition to everything else. The luck of being specific, of having the kind of mind that tracked details and saw patterns. The luck of Caleb's wagon coming through her gate at exactly the moment it did. The luck of Daniel Marsh going to Helena in August. The luck of Harriet Frame having a contact in the governor's office. She had worked hard. She had been brave, in the specific unglamorous way that bravery mostly operates, not as a single dramatic act, but as a series of ordinary decisions made under pressure, most of them made tired and afraid and without certainty of the outcome. But she had also been lucky, and she thought it was important not to pretend otherwise, because the version of the story where pure determination is always enough is the version that makes everyone who didn't make it seem like they simply didn't try hard enough. And that was not true. And she knew it wasn't true. What she believed, sitting at the kitchen table in the morning quiet of the life she'd built, was something simpler and less clean than a lesson, that a person's worth was not determined by how the world initially saw them, but that the world's initial scene was also not entirely without consequence, because it shaped what resources you had and what help reached you and how long you had to fight before anything changed. It mattered, being seen. It mattered, being believed. It mattered having someone come through your gate on a Thursday with supplies you needed and stay longer than the errand required. The frontier did not reward virtue automatically. It rewarded endurance, and endurance required something to hold on to. And what Eliza had held on to had been, at various points, the land itself, a folder of documents, a lawyer's receipt, and the sound of boots on her kitchen floor in the early morning dark. You held what you had. You moved with what was available. And if you were fortunate, genuinely, practically, specifically fortunate, the things you held turned out to be enough. Outside, Caleb called something to Gus that she couldn't quite make out, and Gus said something back. And there was a sound that might have been argument and might have been laughter, and the cattle were moving in the east pasture, and the mountains were where they'd always been, and the post her father had driven into the ground the year she was born was still there, leaning 2 degrees to the west. She had not straightened it. She didn't intend to. Some things you kept not because they were perfect, but because they were yours, and they had stood through everything, and that was exactly enough.